Welcome, everyone, to the Warriors in Business podcast. We are excited and delighted to bring you another episode with an awesome guest today. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Warriors in Business podcast. We are dedicated to serving, promoting, and elevating military, veteran, and first responder-owned businesses. I'm Jordan, one of the hosts for this show, and we are joined by Joe Frankie III. Joe is a West Point graduate, along with being a combat veteran, an award-winning co-author of the book titled LinkedIn. One moment, I will get that delivery again. One second. Joe is an award-winning co-author of the book titled LinkedIn, the 5-Minute Drill for Executive Networking Success. He is also the CEO of JF3 Associates, and a resume that, as I was reading it on LinkedIn, is so long, it'd probably take up 30 minutes of our time here to explain it all. So suffice it to say, he is a well-traveled and very well-experienced man that is happy to join us today on the show. So, Joe, without further ado, how are you, sir?
I am doing fine, and I really appreciate being here with both of you. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And I am joined by Todd, my co-host. Todd, how you doing over there?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm looking forward to talking with Joe. Just on our little pre-show when we were conversing with him, it just sounds like there's a lot of wisdom built up into this young man we're speaking with. So we can't wait till it pours out on us and our audience. And honestly, just full transparency, I know that we're going to be. It sounds like we're going to be talking and diving a little bit deep on LinkedIn and networking on LinkedIn. Joe, I look forward to learning this because even though I've been in the financial technology space for 30 years, I will admit this is an area that I underutilize and Jordan knows this all too well, way too much. In other words, I don't use the power and the leverage of this platform and doing these things, and I need to make myself be more disciplined and be better. So I am a student on this podcast as well as being able and having the honor of conversing with you.
Well, great.
Absolutely. And Joe, before we go any further, the both of us would like to say thank you so very much for your service and sacrifice for our country to keep our communities safe and free. It's a privilege that I did not have personally, and I am forever grateful for those who have done so in my place.
That's right.
It was an honor and distinct pleasure to be a servant of our nation's greatest national treasure, which I consider to be the young men and women in our armed forces.
Amen to that.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. Well, Joe, let's kick off the podcast by first starting off with, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from, and what led you to joining the military to begin with, and how that eventually, your time in the service, and how that eventually led you to transitioning to civilian life to become an entrepreneur?
Well, I grew up 10 miles north of the Mexican border in South Texas, a little town called Los Fresnos, Texas. It's north of Brownsville, which is kind of the tip of Texas.
Yeah.
And so I graduated from high school, and a month later, I was in the U.S. Army. And so I was fortunate enough to get an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy. So a month out of high school, I reported to West Point, graduated from there, and then 30 years of active duty. Spent half of my career, good 14 years, as a warfighter, basically in special forces and the infantry. And then the second half of my career, I transitioned over into quartermaster or logistics and worked logistics issue for the rest of my career, and got out of the Army in 2004 and entered the private sector.
Wow. By the way, note to self, Jordan, you and I need him on our side, not against us, so let's not tick him off, okay? That's an impressive background.
That's very true. Yes, sir. Wonderful. Okay, so service until 2004.
Right.
2004. And then from there, tell us about that transition from military to civilian life.
So, transition to from military life to civilian life. It's funny, as you know, that's coming to you. I mean, because everybody either has a DROS date, a date that they're going to separate from the services, or if you've done enough time, you're going to apply for retirement, and within so many months you're going to retire. So you know when that point is. Um, and what I think is you think you know what you know, but you really don't know. So,
Yeah.
That's
uh,
a great quote, Jordan. We need to remember that and write that down.
so what I found was, uh, in my case, I spent 30 years in the military, so I'm 52 years old, and I just okay, you learn how to write a resume, and you're gonna, pierce the corporate veil and try to get an opportunity. And so I was looking for opportunities to be a project manager, that kind of thing, because I've had missions, knew how to use a crew to get things done. So I wasn't having any luck. And back in my time, in 2004, I mean, a lot of your jobs were in the newspaper,
Right.
and so you did try to know the uh, recruiting firms, and give them your resume. You watch the newspaper. Job boards were just kind of coming about, but the newspaper was really one of your primary sources of published requirements and that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so I wasn't having any luck either. Once you got the interview, nobody called you back, all that kind of stuff. So for me, the darkest time of my life is, when I transitioned out of the military, because I guess, have these expectations that, you've done all this work. I mean, you're a professional engineer, you're licensed, in my case, the state of Pennsylvania. And you have three master's degrees, and you just think you have so much to offer the world. And so finally, one guy helped me out, and I really appreciate this to the day. And he says, technically, I've interviewed you, and I shouldn't have any more conversations for you because we're not going to hire you. And I said, well,
Wow.
um, I said, but I'm qualified for the job. He said, oh, you're the best applicant for this job. And he said, but we're not going to hire you. And I said, well, why is that? And he says, well, you've controlled more people than the CEO. You've handled more money than the CEO.
Wow.
You have worked on bigger programs than the CEO. You could take my job tomorrow. And I said, well, that's kind of funny because I spent most of my military career trying to find the best people because I wasn't the smartest guy in the room and put them
Right.
on my team. And he said, well, some places may work like that, but doesn't work like that here. And he said, look, let me give you a suggestion. Go out and get with some people that are putting something together where you can use your multifunctional talent, on the front end of things. And, I think you'll have better luck. And that was some of the best advice he had given me because at that point, I didn't know what I was doing wrong. And really, I wasn't doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
I didn't fit the mold, of what they were seeking. Um, and so, people, what the private sector is really seeking, in my view, is the young military person that's done, 5 to 7 years of service. I mean, so you've got the discipline, you know what to do, and then they think they have all this bandwidth, uh, to develop you and use you. And so what I would say to people is on the shorter end, I think you're going to have a better job getting opportunity. On the longer end, it's easy, a little bit easier if you just got 20 years in, but if you're in the full 30, you really have to be prepared, networked, and all that stuff. And as I say this, LinkedIn didn't exist for me at that time
Yeah.
as it did today. So the weapon of choice today in transition, if you're a skilled person, you've got leadership skills, you've been a sergeant or something like that, an E5, E6 in the military, then LinkedIn is your tool. If not, and you're just going into a trade type job like welding, millwright or something like that, then you uh, you apply for those opportunities. But either way, a LinkedIn profile, will help you because it says who you are, where you've been, and what you bring to the table.
What, Joe, that's
Yeah.
fascinating to me to hear you say that, because I'm rewording that, and in my brain, the summary of that is, when people serve in the military, you know, the shorter terms, that 5 to 7 year, 5 to 10 year, actually comes out ahead. But the longer you serve, going 20, and in your case, going 30 years, which I would argue, in my simple brain, I would think, you become more equipped, more qualified in civilian life when it comes to the professional side of your, a career versus W-2 or versus entrepreneurship. You're better qualified than most people, but yet the market, and what you experienced anyway, is the market basically said, the opposite. It's an inverse thing of what, to me, common sense is, which is fascinating. But
Yeah, that
someone
is
gave you
fascinating.
but someone gave you some brutal truth and brutal whatever, which, by the way, that I just heard ego. You had more experience and more, all of these things, and that CEO, which just goes down to pride and ego. But it doesn't matter. That's a fight that you had to fight. But you realize that, and and then you understood that, and you still didn't give up, and you went down this path.
Yeah,
Which again,
you
go
have to
ahead.
adjust.
Yeah, you've got to adjust, and I'm sure
Yeah.
your training actually helped you with that too. So how did you? And if there's anything in between here, forgive me for jumping ahead, and you can always back up. So you went from there, and looking at classifieds and papers, and I remember that as well too, looking for opportunities. How did you get to LinkedIn? Because, to be quite frank, okay, let's just say I know a lot of of our seasoned citizens, whatever, that's like, they're looking for tech support from their grandkids, and here you are becoming an expert at all things LinkedIn and LinkedIn marketing. How did that happen? Like, tell us about that path.
Well, so what happened is I got on LinkedIn in 2004. Now, remember, LinkedIn is just something that kind of came about. It was an idea and it's out there. And this is back when, I had the direct phone number to the vice president of marketing, and all of that at LinkedIn. And I even had the marketing department of LinkedIn make me slide decks, PowerPoint slide decks
Oh,
Oh,
that's
cool.
cool.
that would
Yeah.
convince other military people that we're not stealing their identity. Because there was
Oh,
that
wow.
at that time in 2004, you had the .com boom a few years later, and there
Mm.
was all this after effect of hey, these people are stealing your identity, all this kind of stuff. Who would think of putting your name and all the stuff
Yeah.
that's kind of out there.
Especially if that
Right.
just happened. Yeah.
Okay, so that took a whole change of mindset, and so
Agreed.
when I was trying to get these military guys I was talking to, well, I don't know if I don't know if I want to put that out there. So I got these slide decks that showed that what this was really a networking tool to help people get jobs. It doesn't have the it's not like today where you can mention LinkedIn and everybody kind of knows what it is.
Right.
Back then you were like breaking, you were hitting that hammer against the wall trying to make a hole.
Yeah.
And
With
but
already
any
more barriers in between for accepting it, just because of what you had described, the
yeah.
.com burst and all that. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
then once I didn't use it for about the first 6 months. A lady that was at I think Texas Christian University. She was in the grad, helping the people that graduated get jobs, and she had sent me this thing. She said, "I think this is going to be a cool tool, and I think you ought to take a look at this." And so for 6 months, I kind of didn't know what to do with it. And then when I went to work for this outfit where we were going to work on wastewater treatment infrastructure in China, in a cooperative joint venture.
Hmm.
This was, work your way in type thing. This was my first effort at that. What I was trying to find was who in the United States had experience working in China. And so we needed somebody we were looking for. So the company went to a private search firm to find the person, and we paid the money up front, all that kind of stuff. And after some time, they said, "Hey, we've given our best efforts. We're not returning your money. We couldn't find anybody." And
Oh
I said,
man.
"This isn't going to work." And so learned a little bit more about LinkedIn.
Yeah.
and started finding some of the people I needed for this China operation through LinkedIn. So then I really took a deep dive into it. And so by about 2005, I was kind of coaching people on, how to use the tool. And every passing, say, 6 months or so, LinkedIn would add another feature.
Mm-hmm.
And so as it added these features, when it first started, it was just kind of an online resume that you adapted, right? But now, I mean, you name it. If you want to get educated, you can go to LinkedIn and they've got courses, et cetera, you know. And secondly, LinkedIn's owned by Microsoft at this point in time.
Right.
Not when I was there, but Microsoft owns it today. So every time there's something really neat or that LinkedIn wants, it's not short of cash and getting it.
That's definitely true. Yeah.
So I think they won't have any trouble maintaining a pole position from the standpoint of needing to gain resources, out there. In other words, they've got access to power. Um,
Right.
but back then, like I said, it was a little bit more rudimentary, but I was able to find the people I wanted, and even if I found one person, I called them and said, "Hey, you know any other guys that work with you in China?" So use the combination of the phone and that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. But it gave you a reach, and that's what I appreciated. It gave you a reach that nothing else had at that time
Right.
in
Right.
business.
Yeah.
And so as other people were starting to get in the military, I was talking to them. I said, "Hey, you need to translate your skills, what you did in the military, into words that a hiring manager understands in the private sector."
Yeah. Yeah. To be
And
able to put that in a profile that people can read through and know exactly what you've done and how you've done it.
right,
Because I remember from reading. By the way, for everybody listening, Joe is the co-author of the book LinkedIn: The 5 Minute Drill for Executive Networking Success. And I took the time to read it through. It's a short but very effective read, and I think one of the things, Joe, that really stuck out to me, and this is just on the point you were touching on, is that it's it, a tool like this hadn't been made quite yet, and so in early 2004, 2005, it's being early adopted and by people like yourself, and it it brings the small town community feel to a digital platform. Like it's a digital representation of a small town community feel where you feel like you get to know everybody on there, and you could even expand your reach even further. For how many users are there now? 600 million plus users, I think, on
yeah,
LinkedIn, if not more. And
yeah,
and so it's being able to utilize it with that kind of mindset. And I find that fascinating with that. And for those that haven't used LinkedIn, what's the what are some maybe some basic tips that you would give them for being able to market themselves, to connect with others? The book definitely goes through all of it, and we'll be including the book in the podcast description below for everyone to go check out. But Joe, how would you begin to explain someone that hasn't used LinkedIn or has barely touched it, how they could utilize the tool to its full effectiveness?
And by the way, let me jump in there, Joe, and I'll add something to what Jordan said. So, the two-part question. One is someone who has not or very little, has not used it at all or very little. And number two is someone like me. I have, a reasonable amount of followers, but I use it reactively, not proactively, right? And I need to start using it more proactively. And so I think a lot of people out there may have LinkedIn profiles, but they just really don't do much with it. So there's the newbies, and then there's okay, I've been on it for years now, but I haven't really used its power and leverage. So what would you give, what kind of advice or tips or strategies would you give to people, listening to this podcast that could help them with those things?
okay. It's a two-part question. So everybody kind of that I talk to looks at LinkedIn as LinkedIn, right? It's monolithic. It's one thing. And what I looked at it is it's really an education. So there's LinkedIn 101, 201, 301, 401, 501, 601. There's PhD level LinkedIn. But for what most people want,
Interesting.
okay, for what most people want, in my view, you need the cusp or the first semester of 301. Okay. And nobody, if you were going to high school and you were taking English, nobody lets you take sophomore English unless you pass freshman English. You can't take Algebra
Right.
2 without passing Algebra 1, right?
Right.
And so people that aren't on LinkedIn is, hey, go out there. The key to the first thing is build you a really good profile. And you say, well, I don't know what that is. Well, there's some pretty good resources out there. On my website, I have a bookshelf. And the best primer is Rock the World with LinkedIn version 2.0. And Lori Ruff and Mike O'Neill wrote that book. But as far as I'm concerned, it's the primer. And so
Right.
when we wrote our book, when Lori and I wrote our book, we assumed that you knew LinkedIn 101, which was her book, which is how to
Mhm.
build a profile, what the profile sections are about, how big are they, what do they do, why, all of that stuff. So when we wrote our book, we didn't backtrack into 101. We stayed on 201 and the cusp of 301.
Right.
And this is what if you understand LinkedIn, you're already there, you kind of know how to maneuver in it. Then our book, which is a 1 hour book, tells you, how to matriculate and kind of get what you want doing that. So the bottom line up front is if you don't know much about it, then get Lori's book, because believe me, you don't have to know anything, and it's well written, and I still use it as a reference book. Okay. So it's just as good by section as it is to read all the way through. If you're a music enthusiast, Mike and Lori wrote it, referring to 80s music, through there. So it's kind of an
Ooh,
interesting,
that already sounds good. Yeah.
Cool. I'm
interesting
in.
read. It's an interesting read in itself. But if you don't know crap from apple butter, and both of them are brown, start out with that one.
Okay.
Start out with the 101. Duly noted.
Start out with the 101. If you're like Todd, you already got some feel, then go to our book. And even though our book says for executive networking success, the book's being used in high school business classes.
Interesting.
So,
Oh, very good.
yeah. But I mean, if you don't call a book executive, right, no executive is going to read it.
That too.
that doesn't keep high schoolers from reading it either.
Right.
It's aspirational for them at that point. They're like, yes, I would like to be someone called an executive. So I could see, I can see the appeal for them too. Yeah.
But Todd, your question is build a world-class profile. And the reason for that is when somebody says, hey, I know this guy named Todd, and I'm going to refer you to him. And so I give them their name. So what are they going to do in today's world? They're going to go and they're going to look you up on LinkedIn. And so
Right.
your first virtual coffee meeting, in other words, your best foot forward, is at this virtual introduction of yourself that the reader takes on your LinkedIn profile.
Well taken. And, sometimes I tend to not think about it like that too, even though I've been in sales and marketing my whole life, but that's a very good point. That's just perspective at the end of the day. So that's good advice. Well taken. Thank you for that.
Well, the younger generation, Todd, you and I might call somebody, but the younger generation's not going to call anybody.
That's right.
They're going to go straight, and they're going to stay in the non-verbal platform.
Right. Totally agree with that. Totally agree. Let me ask you this. And this is kind of putting you on the spot, and if you don't have anything, that's okay. But, is there any, whether it's yourself or somebody that you know, or maybe it's somebody who's read your book, is there any kind of cool success story, that really, using LinkedIn and or any of the strategies that you talked about in your book, is there anything that comes to top of mind, whether it's yours or somebody that that, use LinkedIn to actually do something that made a real significant impact, on their life and their professional career?
I think there's 103 recommendations on my LinkedIn profile, and you'll find that they're from all different types of people. Some are CEOs, some are financial analysts, some of them are, basically personal assistants, So you get the whole spread from executive to clerical, where they describe um, what has happened to them when they actually made changes on their profile. I mean, they were significant.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Fantastic.
Yeah. 103 for anyone who missed that number. 103 recommendations on there.
So
And
I've coached professionally 705 people, and so I think I've probably learned more from those 705 than they've learned from me.
Funny how life works that way, right?
that's
Yeah.
so true. Yeah.
I've probably seen it.
Right.
Absolutely. It's no that's awesome to be able to connect with others on a global scale like that, with just at your fingertips like that, and to be able to
Well,
not only to give but to receive, in the same way.
well, it's you can develop your relationships. You know, I've coached in 14 different countries. I've never advertised. So what that tells you is that people found me.
Right.
And so one of the powers of LinkedIn is if you're there and if you're there properly, then you can be seen. If you can be seen, you possibly could be communicated with. And if you're communicated with, you might have some outcome like business, new relationship or something.
Right.
But the bottom line is if you're not seen, you don't exist.
Yeah, and I can relate that to just some business starting a website and getting online. I remember back in the '90s when I was in fintech and payment processing, had been in there for years, and then when websites started popping up and home-based businesses were popping up, and that was the big thing. Everyone's got a website, but you were just out there. No one knew who you were, so everyone got these websites out, and no one got any traffic. And I remember that back in the late '90s, '98, '99. And that was really happening a lot. And this is kind of like that too, except the difference is LinkedIn is a platform that has, again, almost 700 million people. So you have traffic within the platform. So what you're saying is that make sure that you're quote unquote marketing yourself, you're your own brand, whatever you want to communicate that with, and having a profile is its own marketing plan within the LinkedIn platform. And I would compare that to the online bravery marketplace that we're doing, which is elevating and promoting military, veteran, first responders, as well as on the consumer side, we're gonna be working to get them everyday discounts and rebates above market average. But that same point, which is we know that the majority, 2 out of 3 Americans would want to seek out and buy from military, veteran, or first responder-owned businesses, but they don't know where they are. So the Bravery
Right.
Marketplace is about bringing them together so we can have that traffic and we can, make them easily found. Same concept, and I'm just kind of using that analogy, which is kind of fascinating to me. I've never just really thought about these things like this. So you're helping me personally put these things in perspective that LinkedIn is that, right? It is an opportunity, but you have to do your own work, so to speak, to create your own quote-unquote storefront, which is yourself and your personal brand and your personal story, so that you can be seen. And you proved it because you didn't do outbound. People found you, and now you've serviced people in roughly 14 countries. Fantastic story. Fantastic story.
Todd, I didn't have a website until the last few years, and the only reason I have a website to this day is it was a requirement of Morgan James Publishing that I have a website.
Oh, wow.
Other than that, the only thing that I ever used was my own LinkedIn profile.
Wow.
That's amazing.
A powerful, that's a great statistic right
So,
there.
Yeah.
Great.
So the challenge is because people will say, well, Joe, I mean, I look at your profile, but who's going to read it? And I said, well, you're looking at it from the standpoint of, there's a lot of stuff there. And I said, I wrote that profile for 1 in 100. The one guy that has a problem, he's looking for somebody to solve it.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried to lay out everything that I've known and done. And they sort through it. And I've had people call me, says, Joe, I mean, I see where you help. We're on a team to rescue this Russian submarine. I said, yeah. And he said, that sounds to me like a very unstructured problem. He said it was extremely unstructured, you know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
he
really.
said, well, I have a problem just like that. And so then that engendered a discussion. But what that told me is he'd gone completely through my profile, every word, and he found what he thought was a piece that motivated him to act and see if I could be, because he thought, well, if I am not the guy, I probably know types of guys or gals
Right.
that could help him. And so we ended up working with him. And so the bottom line is you're in a content war today
Great
in the
point.
digital place.
Yeah, that's so
You're
true.
in a content war.
So true.
Okay. And so people with more content trump people with less content. People with quality content trump that. And people with absolutely compelling content trump them all. And
Yeah.
so the
Good
bottom
point.
line is you have done things and you'd say, well, I did that, way back then, so what's the deal? Well, you don't know what the deal is because you're in your own mind thinking of how you're going to create this. And what I'm saying is, hey, if you've done it, put it out there because you don't know what's going to happen. And for me, a lot of positive things happen, the stuff that I never thought would have anything to do with it. For example, in my volunteer section, I put that I'm a blood donor, and when I donate blood, I put the dates on there and all that kind of stuff. And because it's something I do. And I got contacted by a CEO one time and he said, hey, Joe, I need some help with this, and I said, well, I think I can help you with that. And I said, how did you find me? And he said, you're a blood donor. And I said, what's that got to do? What's that got to do with me solving your problems? And he says, I have a child that requires frequent blood transfusion. And I've decided a long time ago, I'm going to try to give people that are blood donors business.
Wow.
That's incredible. Wow.
So my point is,
Wow.
so what I learned from these things over about 10 years is what you need to do is all of us as individuals, we're a sphere, right?
Mm-hmm.
So imagine you've got this sphere called LinkedIn, and then you've got stories, each individual stories about how you solved a problem. Well, each individual story of how you solved a problem is a little mushroom you put on this sphere.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so pretty soon you put all the stories of in your life that you solve problems or what you bring to the table. So you look like a coronavirus, right?
Yeah. I guess
So
so.
what you're trying to do,
He just said that.
is get one of those little stories to connect with this other person, and then that brings you together, and that engenders a conversation or a message.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it does.
But if you don't have that story there,
Mm-hmm.
then nope. The last thing I tell everybody when I'm coaching them is if it's not on your LinkedIn profile, you never, ever, ever in your life did it.
Right.
Yeah, solid advice right there. Yeah, it's, and I'm glad to hear you say that, especially sharing the story of you putting on there being a blood donor and the CEO contacting you for that reason, because I think I'm one of them, probably one of many people who is somewhat skeptical or somewhat slow to share someone's life online and to put that out there for the world to see for numerous reasons, censorship reasons, privacy reasons, whatever have you. And but yet I think we don't actually think about the flip side of that, of like what opportunities could that bring unless you put it out there, unless you list it, unless you say exactly what you've done, the problems you've solved for other people, or just something unique about you that someone would reach out to, say like, this is why I reached out to you, is because you did this one thing this one time that may seem obscure, that you listed, but it's actually more meaningful to me than you thought it could mean.
Yeah. And hey, Jordan, what Jordan just said, I will actually second that, Joe. So I'm gonna kind of put you on the spot and say, what would you say back to me on what I'm about to tell you, which is I'm that same way. I have always been very, very close with my family. We have a very tight-knit family. Just myself, that anonymity, living in anonymity has kind of been my MO. And it's just, I guess, the way that I grew up and the environments I've been, I guess choices I've made. However, to your point, and like Jordan said, there's a flip side to that. And because when I think about my own LinkedIn profile, for example, there's a whole lot of stuff that I've done or accomplished or I think might be interesting, I don't know, to somebody, just like your story, but I've never done it because I'm kind of trying to stay a little bit under the radar. But it's a mind shift change because, to your point, I'm no telling what I'm missing out. Is that a fair statement? What would you say to me if I was hiring you and you were giving me your wisdom on your consulting services for me building myself up on LinkedIn?
Well, I can tell you with what I've done with a couple of different people over time. We helped them work through this. They developed it, and he said, "Well, Joe, at the end of the day, it's my call, and I don't think I'm going to use this." And I said, "Okay. I mean, it's your stuff. It's not my stuff." And
Right. Yeah.
I said, "Please," I said, "put it in a folder." And he said, "Why would I want to put it in a folder?" And I said, "Because they're going to need it at your obituary."
Whew.
That's a good point.
So,
That is. Yep.
well, do you want to let it work for you now, or do you just want it to be out there so that somebody could find it after you've transitioned?
That's a great point. It's you just punched me in the nose. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I feel a little blood dripping down my nose right now, but it's true. It's true. And I'm having to be open myself up to that, way of thinking.
So,
And
let
I
me tell you
appreciate
what,
that truth.
It was hard for me. And Lori Ruff helped me, work through that because, hey, I come out of the military, operational security. Why
Right.
do I want to put that out there? We got to be watching OPSEC all the time.
Yeah.
And she said, "Well, is this stuff about you classified?" I said, "Well, no, just the fact that I've done it." And she said, "Well, who are you hiding it from?" And she's got an important point. She said, "If you did all these things, you didn't do them by yourself."
True.
I think that's
Very
correct.
true.
Yeah.
There was a team.
Yep.
And in LinkedIn, they have this thing called projects, right? So you can tell a story about you solving a problem, who, what, when, where, why, and the metrics, right? And you can also give credit to the other people that you worked on this project with.
That's right. That's a great point.
Yeah.
So
That's a good point. It's a good feature.
I listed all the people that, some things I did by myself, but a lot of big things, you did it with a team.
Absolutely.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
you want to give them credit too.
100%.
Yep, and that's a great feature and great tool that that everyone can utilize on LinkedIn. And Joe, thank you for pointing that out for us. So I guess as we come to the conclusion of this podcast episode, Joe, I'd just like to ask you for just some final words of advice that you would like to pass along to your fellow military veterans, first responders, whether they are business owners themselves or aspiring entrepreneurs, whether they have taken the 101 LinkedIn course, read Rock the World yet, or they need to move on to 201, 301. What advice would you give to them?
Look, if you're a business owner, look, business, the definition of business is to me battle and risk assessment in the private sector. War and business is the exact same thing. You're evaluating risk continuously and you're making appropriate decisions. And if you look at the history of battles, in depth, at the end of the day, the person that won the battle was the guy that just lasted the longest. It wasn't some brilliant form of strategy.
Last man
It
standing.
wasn't anything else. It was all about, hey, the chutzpah, and not quitting and staying with it. Now, you got to be mindful that stuff's telling you to do other things like finance, all these other kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, if it's your dream, you're working at it, you want it, you just got to stay in there and fight.
Great words of wisdom. And I did not know before this podcast that Jordan had the opportunity to read your book. So I am definitely going to do that personally. I really do mean that. I need to learn more about that, and knowing now, getting to connect with you and hear from you personally, I think that that'll really hit home for me. And so I'm always on the path of learning, throughout this journey of life. So I appreciate you taking the time and explaining and sharing this with the audience. And I hope our audience and listeners actually take that to heart and get your book and really learn too, because I think LinkedIn is an amazing platform to actually build connections, build advertising, brand, all of those things, especially for entrepreneurs whom this podcast is really geared towards from the MBFR side, and any entrepreneur for that matter. So thank you for that. And sorry.
Yeah, the book was it was the hardest thing I ever done, and it's a 1 hour read. So the hardest thing I've ever done is make a book that can be read in 1 hour.
And just 1 hour. With so many thoughts and so much experience, you can only do it in 1 hour. But no, for the listening audience, you heard him say it. It is a 1 hour read, so there's no excuse and no reason not to go and get it. And again, that book title is LinkedIn, the 5-Minute Drill for Executive Networking Success. We'll include the link to that book in the podcast description below, so y'all can go check it out and support Joe and Lori for pouring as much effective wisdom as they could in a 1 hour read. I'm sure that just sounds difficult. I'm also an author. I wrote a children's book, and so to condense it into something real short when you have so much to say, that's a real challenge. So so I applaud you for doing it.
It's
Yes.
not for the faint of heart.
Right.
That's for sure. Absolutely. Well, Joe, thank you so much for coming on to the Warriors in Business podcast. This has been a wonderful discussion on a number of different topics, and so it's been a pleasure talking with you today. Thank you for everything that you share with our audience.
Hey, look, I enjoyed it. It was a pleasure, and would look forward to discussing different types of subjects if you desire to do so.
Absolutely, yes. And here on the Warriors in Business podcast, we seek to provide as much value and resources for business, for entrepreneurship, and everything in between on a number of different topics and subjects. And so, yes, Joe, we would love to bring you on again at some point to pick your brain further, because it seems like there's an entire gold mine that you could share with us. So we would love to do that.
Thank
And
you.
once again, this is another podcast episode for the Warriors in Business podcast. Please go to the various podcast channels that you were listening to this on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or even YouTube. And please subscribe to this channel and share the show with your friends. Please spread the word and share with your fellow peers, your fellow veterans and first responders, so that they can benefit from this advice and wisdom as well to help them in their business pursuits. As well, please go to, if you are a veteran business owner or first responder business owner, or an active duty military business owner, please go to joinbravery.com. That's joinbravari.com to sign up for your free business listing for our online marketplace specifically dedicated to elevating and promoting military, veteran, and first responder businesses. So once again, thanks again for tuning in to this podcast episode. And until next time, God bless, and y'all be good.